When I sit back and look at all the video game franchises that I've played, all the ones that really mean something to me, there's only one video game franchise that I feel like I hold above all else, and that is Final Fantasy. Now, I understand for a lot of people, the name Final Fantasy doesn't hold the same clout that it once was. I understand that this isn't the same game franchise that existed in the late 80s, in the 90s, and throughout the 2000s. And that is kind of why I love it. Final Fantasy to me isn't one thing. It's an ever-changing idea. It's an idea that story can blend perfectly with gameplay, with worlds, with the idea that with a new Final Fantasy entry isn't just a new entry into a game, it's a new entry into a world created by a team of people that believe in this. And with its ups and its downs, I've always stuck by it. Even with the game that I hate the most to the games that I love the most. They all mean something special to me, and they all always impact my life in ways I could never really comprehend until now. Final Fantasy 16 is right around the corner, and I am just super excited for that. And with the hype of Final Fantasy 16, I began to look back at all the Final Fantasy games that I've played and what they really mean to me and the impact they had on my life in those moments. And I kind of just want to take some time to talk about what this gaming franchise really means to me and why I hold it in such high regards. So this isn't going to be a video reviewing like the analytics of the game, or I'm not going to really do any deep dives into the gameplay or mechanics or anything. What I am going to do is I'm just going to talk about what Final Fantasy means to me and why it's so special in my heart. So Final Fantasy was a video game franchise that I had seen due to my older brothers. They had a PlayStation 1, and if you had a PlayStation 1 back in 97, 98, you were playing Final Fantasy 7, you were playing Final Fantasy 8. It was the biggest game of that era. Whenever people look back at early PlayStation, it is synonymous with Final Fantasy during that time. And Final Fantasy was synonymous with the peak of gaming. Final Fantasy at that era was the most innovative, the most graphically intense, the deepest stories with the craziest characters. And it was world renowned for what it was doing in the gaming industry. Now, me at that age, I couldn't really understand why people really cared about these games. I would sit back and I would watch my brothers play it, and I wouldn't really understand the characters of the world. It all kind of really flew over my head, and I don't know why, but they still kind of had a connection. Even though I wasn't really aware of what was going on in the screen, even though I wasn't really aware of the stories and the characters, I was really aware of what they meant to my brothers and that kind of feeling that they got whenever they played a Final Fantasy game. Alright, so when did I actually play a Final Fantasy game? Well, this is the game that really got me hooked and addicted to this world. Final Fantasy X was the first Final Fantasy game I ever actually played with my controller in my hands, and it was the first world I really experienced and the first story that I was ever like engaged in all video games. There's not a single video game that I was really caring about the characters and the story of the world, and I felt like I understood the pressures that was going on and the conflicts that were going on. Even though I didn't really fully understand the deepness of this story, I did understand that these are characters who are struggling with conflicts, whether they be personal or whether they affected the entire world. This was the first time that I really understood the gravity in a situation inside a game and how it affects the characters. Once I played Final Fantasy X, I was madly addicted to this franchise. I went on to play Final Fantasy 12 and absolutely loved Final Fantasy 12, even though it was a complete contrast to what Final Fantasy X was. Then, my older brothers began to show me trailers of Final Fantasy 13, and I was mind blown. The graphical fidelity, the action in the trailer, everything just seemed so much more impactful, and the world was going to be mind blowing. We got the PS3, we get Final Fantasy 13, me giddy with excitement. I installed the game, and man, it was just the biggest letdown. From being such a fan of Final Fantasy X, Final Fantasy 12, to play Final Fantasy 13 and absolutely hate the world they created, hate the characters, be bored to death of the combat in it. Nothing about it felt like the Final Fantasy that I knew and I loved. It was so deflating, but the problem was, for all the hype that I had for Final Fantasy 13, I still had all this hype for Final Fantasy even after I was disappointed by Final Fantasy 13. I still wanted another Final Fantasy adventure, another story to go through, another world to experience. When it clicks to me that there are 9 other Final Fantasy games I have yet to play. I didn't start with the logical step of going to Final Fantasy 9. I went all the way back to the beginning. I went back to Final Fantasy, the original game that started it all. And from there, I was hooked. Even though the game was archaic by even then standards, even though the game wasn't pushing any graphical fidelity, even though the game was slow as all hell, I understood what made a game franchise like Final Fantasy so special. It wasn't graphical fidelity, and it wasn't really like being the most action packed. What makes a game franchise so special is if you can make the game addicting, have a good story, have these things that I felt like at the time I didn't really understood why I was addicted to Final Fantasy. And it wasn't until you strip away all the graphical fidelity, I stripped away all the more engaging combat, and I had just the bare bones Final Fantasy experience that Final Fantasy, the original, offered. And for me to still enjoy it and have fun with the turn-based combat and the world exploration, that is when I truly understood that a game doesn't need all the bells and whistles if the gameplay is just so solid at its core. From there, I went on to play games like Final Fantasy 2, 4, 6, etc., and then forth, until I landed on Final Fantasy 9, which to me was just such a grand epitome of what Final Fantasy is. It is so perfect, from the character development to the world building to the music. Everything was just so impactful and so wonderful. And I really credit Final Fantasy with teaching me that a game doesn't need to be the biggest and baddest. A game just needs to be fun. And to a degree, you kind of just gotta care about the game. You know, whether you're playing a first person shooter, an action adventure game, whatever that game is, if you don't really care about the game and what's going on in the game, then you're not gonna love the game. You're not gonna truly love what that game is because you don't really care too much about it. And Final Fantasy taught me to really care about the game that I was playing. Helped me go on to just love games in general. So my love for video games really stems from my love of Final Fantasy and how it taught me to love a game for everything that it is, not just a hobby or something that kills time, but that these things are really works of art, whether they're very story focused or really gameplay focused or graphically focused. Whatever the focus is, there is a work of art in there. And with work of arts, I think comes a lot of criticisms and comes a lot of opinions. And I feel like whether you hate Final Fantasy or whether you love Final Fantasy, you have an opinion on it. And that's why this franchise is so iconic, because you can despise the hell out of things like Final Fantasy 13, but you can love things like Final Fantasy 7. And this gaming franchise is so diverse that everyone is going to have their least and their favorite ones. And I think that's what's so special, is that they were able to create a decade-long lasting franchise with its own cult followings for every individual game. Even my least favorite game, Final Fantasy 13, has its cult following of people who love that game to death for whatever reason. Now, all this brings us to Final Fantasy 15, which was arguably my most hyped and anticipated Final Fantasy game ever. A lot of us were there when the trailer for Final Fantasy Versus 13 was circulating around YouTube. When a lot of us saw the E3 trailers and we were so excited and hyped for this character, this world. Again, the graphical fidelity was just mind blowing at the time. And it never really slipped my mind that this trailer existed, that this game was in development once upon a time. And when I saw the original trailer for Final Fantasy 15, and it's like, boom, Noctis. That's the guy. That's the guy in the trailer that I once experienced years ago. And we're finally going to get this game. We're finally going to be able to experience this Final Fantasy game that we always really wanted to. And then everyone gets the game, and I feel like everyone's opinion, everyone's criticism were so so opposite. So many people loved the game and so many people hated the game. The game on release day was incomplete. It did not have the full story on the disc, and this was a huge detriment to it. A lot of people could not experience the game for what it was because the full story wasn't there. Or some people didn't even care about the story because the game wasn't really fun for them. They didn't love the open world like some people did. And for me, my opinions on the game, it's not my favorite Final Fantasy game. It's not my least favorite Final Fantasy game. It's just a Final Fantasy game. I think it's not the worst of the worst and it's not the best of the best. It's a very pretty game with very decent characters. The story is fun enough with a lot of deep lore that if you really are invested, you can dive deep and pull so many fun things out of the lore. But should a Final Fantasy game really have you dive that deep into it? Shouldn't it all just be there on day one? And I feel like that's what really pisses people off, is that yeah, this game, it looks great and it has this huge expansive open world, and on paper it seems to do everything right in a Final Fantasy game. You know, you have this lush world with different enemies and you have your party and you're going this journey together, but it seems so hollow, it seems so empty if you were just to play just the main game, if you didn't go and watch Kingsglaive, if you didn't read the mangas, if you didn't do all this extra outside stuff that they kind of required you to get the full experience of Final Fantasy 15. And I feel like that's where my biggest disappointment with Final Fantasy 15 is the fact that this is the first game in Final Fantasy history I did not want to explore it. Exploring this game was so freaking boring. I've never experienced such an open world with literally nothing to do. All the side quests were just a bunch of fetch quests that were so boring. The combat, even though it looked flashy, was so mindless. This was not a game I love in Final Fantasy, but it's still there and it still holds a special place for my heart because of the hype cycle, because of I remember the moment I was when I played it on day one. And to this day, it still has a special place in my heart because it is Final Fantasy. So for all the good and the bad that Final Fantasy has as a franchise as a whole, it is my all-time favorite franchise. It means the world to me. Every single entry into the game marks a special place in my life. From the worst like Final Fantasy 13 to my favorite like Final Fantasy 10 to my most apathetical one, Final Fantasy 15. And to what is now my most anticipated one, Final Fantasy 16. For better or for worse, whatever Final Fantasy 16 ends up being, it's always going to have a place in my heart as, you know, a Final Fantasy game. The 16th entry into my favorite franchise. And it's going to take a whole lot more than the 13s and 15s of the world to like change my mind that this is my favorite franchise, my favorite video game of all time, you know. And I'll always go back and replay the originals. I'll always anticipate the next one. And I don't know, maybe I'm crazy. But yeah, I don't know. Overall, these are my reasons, my thoughts, my emotions, whatever. This is why I love Final Fantasy, why it's always going to have a special place in my heart, and why I'm always going to anticipate the next entry into Final Fantasy. All that being said, you guys, my name is Christian. Do me a favor and like this video if you guys enjoyed this video. Please consider subscribing, as it does help me out tons. Let me know down below, are you guys a fan of Final Fantasy, or do you hate Final Fantasy? Did you used to love Final Fantasy and you're just not excited for 16? Whatever the case, do your stuff in the bottom. Let me know your thoughts. I'll see you guys on the next one.
You probably shouldn't laugh anymore.